On a summer evening in 1998, in apartments all over America, a certain kind of woman sat down in front of the television and saw, for what felt like the first time, a version of her own life looking back at her. Not a wife whose story ended at the wedding, not a mother defined by her children, not a woman waiting patiently in the background of a man's story for him to notice her. Instead, four women in their 30s and 40s, in a city, with jobs and apartments of their own, talking, frankly, hilariously, sometimes shockingly, about sex, about work, about money, and about the strange business of being single and grown up at a moment when the world still didn't quite have a script for that. The show was called Sex and the City, and it ran for 6 years, and it changed, genuinely, the way an entire generation of women thought about their own lives. And now, more than 20 years after it ended, it has become something stranger and more interesting than a hit television program. It has become an argument, a thing that a new generation watches and cannot agree about at all. Half of them enchanted, half of them horrified, and a great many of them both at once. That's the story tonight. Not a lecture, and not a defense, and not an attack. Just the slow, calm story of a show about four women and a city that, in some ways, never really existed. How it was made, what it meant, why it mattered, and why people are still arguing about it decades later, at this very hour, somewhere, right now. If you're here to fall asleep, this is a good moment to settle in properly. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been sitting all day, and let your hands rest, and let your jaw unclench. Nothing in the next hour needs anything from you at all. You can follow the story closely, or let it drift into the background, or fall asleep in the middle and never reach the end. All three are completely fine. That's exactly what this is for. Before we go on, one small thing, and then I won't interrupt again. If this voice helps you get to sleep tonight, leaving a like costs you nothing and helps other people who are lying awake right now find their way here. And if you'd like this to be here again tomorrow night, you can subscribe. That's all. Now let's not think about any of that again, and let's go back to the beginning, which starts not with a television show at all, but with a newspaper column. In the mid-1990s in New York City, a writer named Candace Bushnell was writing a column for a newspaper called the New York Observer. The column was called Sex and the City, and it was more or less a dispatch from a particular world, the world of a certain kind of single woman in her 30s, moving through the restaurants and parties and bedrooms of Manhattan, observing the strange mating rituals of the successful and the lonely with a cold, funny, unsparing eye. It was not sentimental. It was closer to anthropology than to romance. Bushnell was writing about a real social world she moved through herself, and she was writing about it the way a naturalist writes about a species. Here is how they court, here is how they betray each other, here is what they claim to want, and here is what they actually do. She based the central character, at first, on herself, used her own name even in the earliest columns. Then, for privacy, she invented a stand-in, a columnist named Carrie Bradshaw, who shared her initials, CB, and who did the same job, and who moved through the same world. Carrie was Candace, held at arm's length, so that the truth could be told without the teller having to stand fully in the light. The columns were sharp enough, and true enough, that in 1996 they were collected into a book, and the book found its way to a television producer named Darren Star, who had already made his name on glossy, addictive dramas about beautiful people in California. He read it and saw something in it, a world, a voice, a tone that television had never quite had before. And he set about turning a cold, anthropological newspaper column into a warm, funny, deeply human television show. Let your breathing slow here. There's no urgency to any of this. The translation from page to screen changed the thing fundamentally, and it's worth understanding how, because the difference is the whole reason it worked. Bushnell's column was detached, ironic, a little merciless. The show kept the wit but added something the column had mostly withheld: warmth, love, above all, friendship, because the genius of the television version, the thing that made it more than a chronicle of dating disasters, was that it made the real love story of the show the friendship between four women rather than any of their relationships with men. The men came and went. That was almost the point. But the four women stayed, and the show was, underneath all the sex and the shoes and the city, a 6-year love letter to the kind of friendship that holds a life together when the romances don't. That's what people actually came back for, week after week. Not to find out who Carrie ended up with. To spend time in the company of four people who genuinely, reliably, showed up for each other. Let's meet them, slowly, because they became so familiar to so many people that they stopped being characters and started being a kind of shorthand, a way that a whole generation of women would sort themselves and their friends. There was Carrie, the narrator, the writer, played by Sarah Jessica Parker. She was the center of it, the one whose voice you heard, the one turning her own romantic catastrophes into a weekly newspaper column, which is a very neat trick, a character whose job is to observe and narrate the exact life she is failing to manage. She was romantic, self-absorbed, stylish to the point of absurdity, endlessly analyzing, and permanently exhaustingly in love with a man the show simply called Mr. Big, an emotionally unavailable, glamorous, maddening figure who came and went from her life for 6 years like weather. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. None of this is a test. You don't have to hold on to any of it. There was Samantha, played by Kim Cattrall, and she was, for a lot of viewers, the real revolution of the show. Samantha was a woman in her 40s who approached sex the way the culture had always allowed men to. Appetite without apology, pleasure without guilt, no interest whatsoever in being made respectable by a relationship. She was successful, confident, completely unbothered by other people's opinions of how a woman her age should behave. Television had genuinely never had a character quite like her, a middle-aged woman who was sexual, unmarried, unashamed, and presented not as a cautionary tale or a joke, but as aspirational. People found her liberating, or scandalous, depending on where they were standing, and often both. There was Charlotte, played by Kristen Davis, the romantic, the traditionalist, the one who believed, sincerely and against all evidence, in the fairy tale. She wanted the husband, the home, the whole conventional dream, and she pursued it with an earnestness that the show treated tenderly rather than mocking. Charlotte mattered because she was the counterweight. In a show about women rejecting the old script, she was the one who still wanted it, and the show never punished her for that. It let her want what she wanted. And there was Miranda, played by Cynthia Nixon, the lawyer, the cynic, the sharp one, career-driven, skeptical of romance, quick to puncture the other's illusions, and quietly the most grounded of the four. Miranda was the one who worked the hardest, trusted the least, and was, in many ways, the character the show's later admirers would come to love most, because she was the one wrestling most honestly with the actual costs of the life they were all living. 4 women, 1 city, and a friendship that was, in the end, the marriage the show actually believed in. Breathe out slowly. Let the shoulders drop again if they've crept up. Now, the city itself, because the city was, as people said at the time and have said ever since, the 5th character. The New York of this show was not quite the real New York. It was a heightened, glowing, impossibly glamorous version of it, a city of rooftop parties and perfect brunches and apartments that, as a whole generation would later work out with a calculator and a rising sense of betrayal, none of these characters could possibly have afforded. It was New York as a dream of New York. And for millions of people watching from suburbs and small towns and other countries entirely, it sold a fantasy so powerful that people genuinely moved to the city because of it, arrived with suitcases and this show in their heads looking for the version of Manhattan it had promised them. That gap between the dream city of the show and the actual city of rent and subways and exhaustion is one of the things a newer generation cannot stop pointing at. And they're right, of course. The economics of the show are pure fantasy. But it's worth being fair to what it was doing. It was never a documentary. It was a fairy tale for grown women, and fairy tales are set in castles, not in accurate reproductions of the housing market. The city was a dream on purpose. That was the product. Let the room go soft around that for a moment. A glowing, impossible city at night, seen from a taxi window. Let's talk about why it mattered, genuinely, at the time. Because from the distance of now, with all the criticism piled on top of it, it's easy to forget how radical it actually was in 1998. Consider what television had offered women before it. Wives, mothers, girlfriends, women whose stories were, almost without exception, about their relationships to men and children. Women who existed in the plot to support someone else's journey. A single woman over 30 on television was very often a figure of pity or comedy. The spinster, the desperate one, the cautionary tale, about what happens if you don't settle down in time. And here came a show that said, flatly, without apology, these four women are the main characters. Their careers matter. Their friendships matter. Their pleasure matters. Their being single is not a problem to be solved by the final episode. It's simply the texture of their lives, as valid and full and interesting as anyone's. The show took the exact demographic that the culture had spent decades quietly pitying, the unmarried woman in her 30s and 40s, and made her the heroine, the one you wanted to be, the one with the great apartment and the great friends and the great shoes and the interesting life. That was new. It's hard to overstate how new it was. Women wrote in to say they had reorganized how they thought about their own lives around it, that they had stopped seeing their single years as a waiting room and started seeing them as a life. The show gave a whole generation permission to want things the previous generation had been taught not to admit to wanting: independence, sex, ambition, a life not organized entirely around a husband. It won awards, dozens of Emmy nominations, several wins. It helped turn its network into the home of prestige television, part of the same wave that we've talked about on other nights, the wave that made television a place serious things could happen. And it made its four leads into icons, and its city into a destination, and its central question, can a woman have it all, and what does all even mean, into a conversation that ran far beyond the show itself. Let your body get heavier now. Let the mattress take all of it. And then, because nothing stays simple, the show got old, and the world changed around it, and a new generation arrived to watch it, and they did not see what their mothers had seen. This is the most interesting part of the whole story, and it's the part that makes the show worth an hour rather than a highlight reel. Because a piece of art that was genuinely progressive in 1998 can look, to eyes trained by 2025, like something else entirely. And Sex and the City has become one of the great examples of that. A show that was ahead of its time and is now, in certain ways, behind it, and is watched by young people today in a spirit their mothers would find bewildering. As a kind of fascinating historical artifact, half admired, half mocked, endlessly discussed. What do the new viewers see that the old ones didn't? They see, first, how narrow the world of the show is. 4 wealthy white women in Manhattan, and a city that, in the show's version, is almost entirely populated by people like them. A newer generation, raised on the expectation that a story about a city should contain something like the actual variety of that city, notices the absence immediately, and finds it strange, and says so. They see the money problem, the fantasy economics we already talked about, and where their mothers saw aspiration, they often see something closer to delusion, or privilege that the show never examines in itself. And they see the central romance completely differently. To a great many original viewers, Carrie's 6-year on and off pursuit of the emotionally unavailable Mr. Big was romantic. The great love story, the one worth waiting for. To a great many newer viewers, it reads as something closer to a case study in exactly the kind of relationship you would beg a friend to leave. The man who won't commit, who appears and disappears, who makes her miserable for years. The new generation, fluent in a language of emotional health that barely existed in 1998, looks at that and does not see romance. They see a red flag, 6 years long. Let all of that soften now. There's nothing here you need to fix tonight. But here's the turn, and it's the thing that keeps the show alive rather than simply dated. Because the newer generation also does something their mothers didn't. They reassess who the real heroine was. For years, the show was understood to be about Carrie, the narrator, the romantic, the center. But a whole strand of newer viewers has decided, more or less, that Carrie was the problem all along, and that the real wisdom of the show was sitting quietly over in the corner the whole time, in the character of Miranda. Miranda, the cynic, the lawyer, the one who kept pointing out that the emperor had no clothes, that the men were behaving badly, that Carrie was making the same mistake again. The character who was at the time sometimes seen as the difficult one, the buzzkill, has been reclaimed by a generation who look at her and think, she was right. She was right about everything. She was the only one telling the truth. That's a genuinely fascinating thing to happen to a piece of art. For the audience, decades later, to quietly agree that the show's designated wisecracking side character was actually its moral center, and that the heroine we were all told to identify with was, in fact, the one making all the mistakes. It means the show is richer than it knew. It planted a truth-teller in the corner and called her the cynic, and time has revealed her to be the one who saw clearly. Let your breathing follow that. Slow and unhurried. We should spend a little unhurried time on how strange and unlikely the whole thing was as a piece of business, because from where we sit now, it looks inevitable, and it was anything but. In the late 90s, the idea of a television show built entirely around the sex lives of 4 single women, talking explicitly about desire and disappointment, was not an obvious hit. It was a risk. The subject matter was frank enough that only a subscription channel would touch it. The premise, no central man, no family, no traditional hook, just 4 female friends in a city, broke most of the rules about what held an audience. There was no guarantee that men would watch a show so completely uninterested in them, and a real fear that the show would be dismissed as narrow or scandalous or simply too much. What it had going for it was the same thing the other great shows of that era had. A channel that made its money from subscriptions rather than advertising, and therefore didn't need everyone to be comfortable. It only needed enough people to love it enough to keep paying. And that freedom, the freedom not to be for everyone, is what let it be so specifically, unapologetically for the women it was about. It didn't have to soften itself to sell washing powder to a general audience. It could just be exactly what it was, and trust that the people it was for would find it. They found it. And in finding it, they turned a risky, frank, structurally odd little show into a cultural phenomenon that outlived its own era by decades. The lesson, which is the same lesson as with the other shows of that time, is that the thing which looks like a commercial weakness, being for a specific audience rather than everyone, is often the actual source of the power. The show that tries to be for everyone is usually for no one. The show that is completely, unashamedly for someone is the one that gets loved. Let that settle. Let it go quiet. It's worth pausing, too, on the sheer specificity of what it captured, because that specificity is part of why it dates and part of why it endures at the same time. It caught a very particular moment, the turn of the millennium, in a particular city, among a particular class of women, at a particular point in the long, slow change in how women were allowed to live. It's a period piece now, whether it meant to be or not, a document of what independence looked like and cost and felt like at that exact moment, before the phones, before the apps, before so much of the machinery that shapes how people meet and love now. Watching it today is a little like reading letters from a slightly earlier version of the world, recognizable, but foreign, close enough to touch, far enough to feel the distance. And that's part of why the newer viewers can be so hard on it and so drawn to it at once. It's near enough to feel relevant, to feel like it's about their lives, and far enough that its assumptions have visibly aged, which is the exact recipe for the kind of affectionate, argumentative, can't-look-away relationship a new generation has with it. Too old to simply agree with, too close to simply dismiss. So they argue, so they keep watching. Let your body get heavier. There's nothing to resolve here. There's a thread worth following about the friendship itself, because it turned out to be the show's most quietly radical idea, more radical even than the sex. The culture, for a very long time, had treated female friendship as secondary, as the thing women did while waiting for the real story, which was a man, to arrive. Friendships were the background, romance was the foreground, and this show almost sneakily inverted that. It made the romances the background, the parade of men who came and went, and the friendship the foreground, the constant, the actual spine of every character's life. That inversion did something to how a generation of women understood their own relationships. It suggested that the friends were not the consolation prize you kept until the husband arrived. The friends were the main event. The friends were the people who would still be there when the husbands had come and gone, who would show up at the hospital and the funeral and the 2 a.m. phone call, who constituted, in the end, the real and lasting love story of an adult life. A lot of women took that seriously and reorganized their sense of their own lives around it, took their friendships more seriously, valued them more highly, understood them as central rather than peripheral. That's a genuine cultural shift, and this show was a real part of it. Not the shoes. The idea that your friends might be the great love of your life. That one lasted. Let it soften and drift. There's a bigger idea underneath all of this, and it's worth turning over slowly in the dark, because it applies to far more than one television show. Every piece of art that engages honestly with its own moment is, in a sense, making a bet about what will still look true later. And almost nothing wins that bet completely. The things that felt most daring and current in 1998 are exactly the things most likely to look dated now, precisely because the culture moved in the direction the show was pushing. Sex and the City helped make a world in which its own attitudes toward race, money, and relationships would come to seem limited, which is a strange kind of success. It won the argument so thoroughly that it now looks conservative, because everyone absorbed its radicalism and moved past it. That's the fate of the genuinely influential. The revolutionary becomes the ordinary, becomes eventually the slightly embarrassing. Not because it was wrong, but because it worked. The things it fought for stopped being battles and became assumptions. And once something is an assumption, the work that fought for it looks quaint. You only notice the door being opened if you remember it was ever closed. So when a young person today watches the show and finds it narrow, or dated, or politically clumsy, they are, without knowing it, measuring it against a world it helped create. The very standards they judge it by are, in part, standards it moved the culture toward. That's not a small irony. It's the whole life cycle of an influential thing, compressed into the experience of one person on a sofa, half laughing at their mother's favorite show. Let that settle. Let it drift. We should sit for a while with the character of Samantha, because she is, in retrospect, the most interesting test case for the whole question of how the show has aged, and it's a gentle enough thing to think through as you settle. When the show aired, Samantha was often treated as the comic extreme, the outrageous one, the one whose appetites were played partly for laughs, the friend who said the shocking thing. But look at her again from now, and something has shifted. Samantha was the only one of the four who was genuinely, completely free of the need for male approval. She did not want to be chosen. She did not organize her life around finding a husband. She enjoyed her work, her body, her independence, and other people's opinions of her simply did not reach her. She was, in the terms a newer generation would use, the most liberated character on the show. And the show, to its credit, never punished her for it, never gave her the standard fate the culture usually reserved for such women, the lonely comeuppance, the tragic third act. She just went on being herself, unbothered, into her 40s and beyond. And a newer generation, looking back, has quietly recognized that the character they were invited to see as the joke was, in many ways, the one who had it most figured out. It's the same move as with Miranda, time revealing that the show's designated extreme character was actually its clearest picture of freedom. There's something to sit with there. The way the figures a culture treats as too much, as excessive, as embarrassing, are so often the ones a later, freer culture looks back on and recognizes as having simply arrived early. Let the room go soft around that. Let's talk about narration, because the show did something with voice that's worth noticing, especially at this hour. The whole series was narrated by its central character. You heard Carrie's voice over the images, framing everything, turning every episode into, in effect, one of her columns, posing the week's question, working through it, arriving at some small provisional piece of wisdom by the end. That device, the voice guiding you through, is part of what made the show feel so intimate. It was as though a friend were telling you about her week, thinking out loud, letting you inside her head. That structure, a calm voice, narrating, turning the raw material of a life into a story with a shape, is, when you think about it, not so far from what's happening right now in this room, in the dark. A voice framing things, turning events into something you can rest inside rather than something you have to live through. The show understood the deep comfort of being told a story by a voice that has already made sense of it, that has already found the shape. There's a reason people found it soothing to fall asleep to, long before anyone was making sleep stories on purpose. Let your breathing follow that. Slow, unhurried. A voice framing the world, asking nothing of you. We should give some time to the individual pieces of it, because a show that runs 6 years and 90-4 episodes accumulates a whole world of small, specific things, and the specific things are what people actually remember. The clothes first, because the clothes were genuinely revolutionary in their own right. The show treated fashion not as decoration but as language, as a way the characters spoke, argued, and expressed who they were. The costume design became famous in its own right, turning a stylist into a household name and making certain items of clothing into objects of desire for millions of people who would never own them. The show could stop its own plot dead to admire a shoe, and the audience loved it for that, because the clothes were part of the fantasy, part of the dream city where everyone dressed as though every day mattered. There was a particular pair of shoes, a particular designer, that became so associated with the show that the brand name entered the language as shorthand for a whole idea of aspirational femininity. There were outfits so strange and bold that they are still argued about. The show made getting dressed into a form of self-expression and self-respect, and for a lot of viewers that was genuinely empowering. The idea that adorning yourself, taking pleasure in how you looked, was not vanity, but a kind of authorship of your own life. Newer viewers, of course, look at some of the outfits and simply laugh, which is its own kind of tribute. You only keep looking at clothes 20 years later if they were bold enough to be worth laughing at. Let the room go quiet around that. A closet, a city, a life dressed for. Then there was the frankness, which is easy to forget now, but was genuinely startling then. The show talked about sex, women's desire, women's disappointments and preferences and demands, with a directness that television simply had not permitted before. It was on a subscription channel, which, as we've discussed on other nights, was the whole reason it could exist. No advertisers to keep comfortable, no need to be acceptable to everyone. That freedom let it say things out loud that a whole generation of women had only ever said to their closest friends, if at all. For a lot of viewers, that was the most liberating thing about it. Not the shoes, not the city, but the simple fact of 4 women talking about their actual lives, their actual bodies, their actual disappointments, without shame and without lowering their voices. It made a private conversation public, and in doing so, it told millions of women that the things they'd thought were theirs alone were, in fact, shared, that the whole confusing business of being a grown single woman was something other people were fumbling through too. Let your hands go heavy. Let the pillow take all of it. There's the matter of the ending, and of what came after. And it's worth handling gently because it's where a lot of the later disappointment lives. The show ended in 2004, after 6 seasons, and it ended, more or less, by giving everyone what they wanted. The romance is resolved, the loose ends tied, the fairy tale, in the end, delivered. Some people loved that. Others felt that a show which had spent 6 years questioning the old scripts about love and marriage had, at the last moment, lost its nerve and handed everyone a conventional happy ending after all. That argument, did it betray itself at the end or did it earn its warmth, is one people still have. And then, as successful things do, it refused to stay ended. There were films, years later, which many fans wish had not been made. There was, more recently, a revival series which attempted to take the same characters into a completely changed world and to reckon somewhat awkwardly with everything the original had been criticized for, adding the diversity it had lacked, aging its characters into a new era, trying to answer its own critics inside its own story. The results divided people enormously, but the very existence of that revival is a kind of proof of the original's strange afterlife, a show that could not be left alone, that each new era felt compelled to return to, argue with, apologize for, and continue. That's not what happens to ordinary television. Ordinary television ends and is forgotten. This one ended and became a permanent argument, revisited by every new generation on its own terms, which is, in the end, the clearest possible sign that it was never really about the shoes. Let all of that go loose now. Let it get soft and far away. There's a question worth turning over slowly, because it sits underneath the whole modern argument about the show. Was it feminist, or wasn't it? And the honest answer is that it depends entirely on what you mean by the word, and that the argument about the show is really an argument about that, using the show as the battleground. By the standards of 1998, it was genuinely radical. It put women's desire, women's ambition, and women's friendship at the center of the story, and refused to make marriage the point. That was, for its moment, a real act of liberation, and a lot of women experienced it exactly that way. By the standards of now, critics point out its limits fairly. Its idea of a liberated life was extremely bound up with money, with consumption, with a very narrow slice of privilege. Its feminism was, in a sense, a feminism of individual freedom for already advantaged women, rather than anything broader, the freedom to shop, to choose, to enjoy, without much attention to who couldn't. And its endless focus on romance, even as it questioned romance, meant the whole show still orbited the question of men more than its reputation suggests. Both of these readings are true. It was liberating, and it was limited, radical, and narrow, ahead of its time and thoroughly of its time, all at once. And the reason it's worth stating both rather than choosing is that this is simply what influential art is like. It moves the world in one direction, and in doing so, reveals all the directions it didn't move. Its achievements and its blind spots are the same object seen from two sides. The mistake is to think you have to pick, to decide it was either a feminist triumph or a shallow consumerist fantasy. It was both, fully, at the same time, and the tension between those two truths is exactly what makes it still worth arguing about. A thing that was simply one or the other would have been settled long ago and forgotten. It's the contradiction that keeps it alive. Let all of that go loose now. It's not a question for tonight. Let's go back to Candace Bushnell for a while, the woman who started all of it, because her own story is a quiet counterpoint to the fantasy she accidentally launched, and it's a gentle thing to think about. She wrote a column about a world she lived in, and she invented a character to stand in for herself, and that character became one of the most famous fictional women of her era, more famous, by far, than Bushnell herself. There's something strange and a little melancholy in that. To create a version of yourself so vivid that it eclipses you, so that for the rest of your life you are known as the real person behind an invention that everyone loves more than they will ever love the real you. And the invention diverged from her. The television Carrie got the fairy tale ending. Bushnell, in real life, lived a different, more complicated, more honest version of the single life the show had glamorized. One with the freedoms the show celebrated, but also the genuine cost the show tended to smooth over. She has spoken, in later years, with real candor about what it's actually like to be a woman living independently into her 60s, about the parts the fantasy left out, about the difference between the dream she helped sell and the life she actually lived. There's a whole meditation available there, if you want one, about the gap between the stories we tell about a life and the life itself, about how the person who invents the beautiful version often ends up living the ordinary one, watching the world fall in love with a self she made up. But it's late, and that's a heavy thought, so let it pass gently through and drift on. Let your breathing lengthen. In and out, longer. We should say a word about the actresses themselves, because the four of them became so fused with their characters that it's easy to forget they were people doing a job, and that the job changed their lives in ways both wonderful and complicated. To play a single character for 6 years, and then to have that character follow you for the rest of your life, to be recognized forever as her, is a strange kind of fame. Some of them embraced it. Some had a more difficult relationship with being permanently identified as a person they had invented and then left behind. There were tensions over the years, famous ones, about the films and the revival and who would return and on what terms, the ordinary human friction of people whose lives had been welded together by a shared success and who did not, off-screen, share the seamless friendship their characters had. There's something quietly instructive in that, and gentle enough to rest on. The show's deepest subject was female friendship. Its great fantasy was 4 women who would always be there for each other. And the real women who created that fantasy had, like all real people, a messier, more complicated, more human set of relationships than the perfect one they portrayed. The fantasy was real to millions precisely because it was a fantasy, a smoothed, idealized version of something that, in life, is always harder and more tangled than it looks on screen. That's not a disappointment. It's just the ordinary gap between art and life. The people who make the beautiful, seamless thing are, underneath, as knotted and imperfect as everyone else. The seamlessness is the art. The knots are the life. Both are true, and there's no contradiction in it, only the usual distance between the story and the people who tell it. Let all of that soften and drift. Here's something worth sitting with about why the show still generates so much heat so many years later, when most television of its era has simply faded. It's because it was about questions that are still open. The show asked, can a woman have both a great career and a great love, or does the world still make her choose? It asked, is marriage the goal, or a trap, or simply one option among many? It asked, is a life of freedom and independence a triumph or a loneliness, and is that even the right question? It asked whether the old scripts about how a woman should live had been replaced by anything better, or just by a new set of pressures wearing the costume of liberation. None of those questions have been answered in the years since. They can't be, really, They're not the kind of questions that get answered. Each generation of women arrives at them again, fresh, and has to work them out for itself, and finds the previous generation's answers both useful and insufficient. Which is exactly why a new generation keeps returning to this show, not because it solved anything, but because it was asking the questions they're still asking, in a form vivid enough to argue with. You argue with the things that are still alive. Nobody argues with a show that's genuinely finished. The fact that young women today watch this decades-old program and get genuinely, personally worked up about it, furious at Carrie, in love with Miranda, scornful of the money, moved despite themselves by the friendship, is the surest sign that its central questions are still their questions too. Let that sit there in the quiet, without needing to resolve into an answer. There's one more thread worth following gently before we close, and it's about the city changing underneath the show. The New York the show captured barely exists anymore, and that adds a layer of melancholy to watching it now that wasn't there at the time. The particular restaurants, the particular kind of nightlife, the specific texture of a certain Manhattan at a certain moment, much of it has been swept away by the years, by rising rents, by the flattening of cities into more or less the same set of expensive sameness everywhere. The show is now, among other things, a record of a place that has largely vanished, filmed on real streets that no longer look quite like that, populated by a version of the city that the actual city is priced out and paved over. That gives it an accidental poignancy. It set out to sell a dream of New York, and it ended up preserving one, holding, in amber, a version of the city that people who were there remember and people who weren't can only visit through the screen. Every long-running show set in a real place becomes, eventually, a kind of ghost story about that place. Here is how it looked. Here is who was here. Here is a world that was and isn't. The show didn't mean to become that. But time turns every honest portrait of a place into an elegy for it. There's something restful in that thought, oddly, that things are held somewhere, even after they're gone. That a version of a summer evening in a city in 1998 still exists, exactly as it was, and can be returned to, and will not change, no matter how much the real place does. Let that settle in the quiet. A city that was, held safe, unchanging, in the amber of a story. There's a smaller, kinder thing to end the substance on, before we let the night take over completely. Underneath all the analysis, the fashion, the fantasy, the dated politics, the reclaimed cynic, the 6-year red flag, the thing that actually made people love this show and keeps them loving it is very simple, and it has nothing to do with any of the arguments. It's the 4 of them at a table. The image the show returns to, again and again across all 6 years, is 4 women sitting down together, at brunch, at a bar, in someone's apartment, and talking. Just talking. Telling each other the truth, or trying to. Laughing, disagreeing, showing up. Every episode came back to that table. Whatever disaster had happened, whatever man had disappointed, whatever crisis was underway, it got brought back to the table and shared, and in the sharing, it became bearable. That's the real fantasy the show was selling. Not the shoes, not the apartment, not even the city. The fantasy was that you might have 3 people who would always reliably be at the table, who would hear the whole embarrassing story and not judge you, who would show up for the crisis, who would be there for decades. That's the thing people actually longed for, underneath the glamour, not the man. The friends. And that's a thing worth wanting, and worth resting on as you drift off. Not the impossible apartment or the impossible city, just the table and the people who stay at it. Let all of it loosen now. All of it. You don't need to remember any of this. Not the names of the 4 women, not the dates, not the arguments about the ending or the reclaimed cynic or the fantasy economics. None of this is a test, and there's nothing waiting for you on the other side of it. Your breathing has already slowed without you asking it to. The weight of your body has already settled into whatever's holding it up. The small tensions in the jaw, in the hands, in the place behind the eyes, have already begun to let go on their own. Whatever your own life looks like tonight, married or single, in the city or far from it, with your table full or still looking for it, it's all right, exactly as it is. There's no script you're failing to follow. There never really was. There's nothing left to follow now. The story is over, and there's nothing more you need to listen to. What comes next is just soft, gentle sound. No more words, nothing to follow, only a quiet hum to carry you through the rest of the night. So let go of everything now. Let the last of the day come loose, and let this gentle sound stay with you until morning.